Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in April 2023. And this is a very topical topic because it's about ChatGPT impact on cyber and application security. And we have a great set of panels. Dinis, I run the Open Security Summit. I'm the CISO of London Barrett and the Chief Scientist of Glasswall. Sam, quick introduction by you.
Yeah, I'm Sam Stepanian. By day, I'm an independent application security consultant, but also volunteer as OWASP London chapter leader for the past 7 years. I also a project co-leader on 2 of OWASP projects, OWASP NetTacker and OWASP WAF evaluation criteria. And I made numerous contributions to OWASP, including OWASP ZAP and OWASP Top 10. So that's me.
Cool. Maybe Nathan?
Hi, I'm Nathan Case. I am a security advocate for Datadog. I spend most of my day talking about security geeky stuff. This is about as geeky as it gets right now, so I'm really excited to have this talk. I am decidedly far more on the security side than the AI side, so I'm excited to see where this goes. Obviously, views I express are my own, not Datadog's.
Exactly. Scott?
Scott Gady, longtime application security practitioner, enterprise architect, just starting the journey into like AI type activities, but been following kind of Gary McGraw with machine learning, been part of OWASP for quite a while. And that's an interesting topic, you know, taking open and pulling it into ChatGPT to kind of help provide more information to people and how you validate that, right? I mean, so I'm real interested in the topic, happy to contribute, have to drop it half past, but.
That's all right, no worries. So I think what we could do is, right, let's stay a little bit away from the whole privacy, feeding data to the models sort of thing, right? Because, you know, let's kind of assume that these versions and the next versions, for example, of the models will have solved that people will be able to create models on top of private data. People will create models on top of things that, you know, let's not look at some of the poisoning of the models, because I do feel that there's an area here which is, you know, the people who control the models can actually do a lot of stuff, including to identify malicious access, etc. And we know part of that, right? So why don't we start with, in a way, what is the big difference, right, with, I would say, the GPT, the ChatGPT like technologies and the AIs that came before, right? I'll add that for me, it was context. It was the ability to have a dialogue. It was the ability to express what I want instead of reverse engineering what I want into a Google search and then go and hunt for articles that kind of have what I want, and then find almost like 80% of what I want, and then start again, right? So for me, it was that sort of, you know, Iron Man Jarvis kind of dialogue that I never really had before with anything that was AI specific.
Yep.
What about you guys say?
Yeah, it was getting back, asking a question, getting a single answer composed from multiple search results instead of a list of search results that then you had to dig into. Because then you dug into them and you went on long trails. So you didn't get I would say, context and conciseness.
Well, and I would go so far as to posit, this is one of the first times, so I'm going to go back and give you a memory that I have of 5 years ago. Speaking to a security vendor that was telling me about his wonderful AI product, and we talked about it, and like the more discussion we got into it, I was like, well, you're just doing this huge if then else sort of a thing. That's not really like machine learning or AI. That's just a really big if then statement, which cool, but like not really what we're talking about here. And so I think this is the first time we've actually been able to say it's contextual. It understands. It's able to search on general words and sentiment that you give it and then give you back reasonable results. Though how reasonable becomes a question of how well it's been trained.
Yeah, and from my side, I think I was mostly impressed, of course, with the fact that it understands code, it writes code, and of course, one of the topics we're going to discuss today, it actually remediates the vulnerabilities in the code. This was my big revelation, kind of, exactly, with a pinch of salt. But the fact is that, again, because we created a lot of content at OWASP over the past 20 years, And a lot of people complain it's quite difficult to navigate this content. So if you just go to a search engine like Google and you ask about vulnerability, you're gonna get, I don't know, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of responses. And depending on what you click, you read those pages, you will still not understand what's going on. And I think that's the ability to get the summary. And there's even a way to ask ChatGPT to explain a vulnerability like you are a 5-year-old, or if you are an 80-year-old, which I think is quite unique. And this is something what we didn't have, even though AI was in security for a long time. But yeah, I think every single SaaS vendor which claimed that they have AI, I've never actually seen it successfully applied until now that we're seeing in ChatGPT, which I think is probably going to affect a lot of SaaS vendors because of the topics we're going to discuss next.
Well, I think every single SaaS vendor should be on the warpath at the moment, right? Because their whole business could disappear, right? As soon as somebody integrates equivalent, ChatGPT like models. Because if I can go to the point, in fact, I haven't fully tested yet, but the latest version of Copilots, I don't know if you guys used it, but the latest version of Copilot actually claims to actually look at the whole code. Have you guys seen that one? GitHub Copilot, right? So
Yeah.
the first version was, which is already pretty spectacular, I have to say, right? It's already was really good at creating really good recommendations. But the new version, apparently, which I haven't tested because I don't think they have fully released it. It actually claims to look at the whole code, including writing unit tests, but with the whole code in context. Now, from there to actually finding all class of security vulnerabilities and connect all sorts of stuff, you're very, we're not that far, right? It's almost like that's the heavy lifting to be able to do that.
Man, it's an interesting question. Can you ask your ChatGPT to create you a framework by which you can complete your code quicker? I mean, dude, I can think of all of the things that I've had to code in my lifetime, and the amount of code that I've written that was just, gee, does this work? And to get past that section and go right to well, this is perfect. I mean, we have a hard enough time getting people to evaluate, should I actually do this, that, or the other, or evaluate variables as they go into code. So it's a little scary because, there's some level of discipline that you have to make sure this is actually enacted here.
But think of the questions you can ask, right? Like if I go back to my O2 platform days, right? Which
Yeah.
I still feel that I was doing stuff that today people still don't do, right? The way I got crazy success was by, imagine this on the SaaS engine, right? I got to the point where I would delete all the rules from the database. I had access to one of the engines, right? And then I would create a call graph of everything. Then I would taint every entry point and external point. So I would get millions of traces, literally millions of traces. The beauty of that is that I would spend some time mapping the inputs and the outputs. And then I have these almost real-time view where the data arrived. And the ability that I then had to really very quickly say, I care about that, I don't trust this. And even to say, okay, so this XML file contains the glue between these web services and non-web service there. So you go like that. Then you go to the database and you come like that. So create those trees, that context, which is really what advanced static analysis can actually give you. That's kind of how you really, can do this. My problem was I couldn't describe the model. Right now, I feel I'm getting to the point where I could start to describe the behavior that I want for the web services, the behavior that you want for all these things. And that's a game changer.
I think it's interesting to be able to say like this.
Well, if you can create the pattern, then you can take a large code base and boil it down to what fits the pattern and what doesn't, and then focus on what doesn't, right? So you can apply that you can apply it to testing, security testing, even stuff like code, like checking in comments and having a consistent framework for that, where people might not even put that in. So if you could generate comments from code that's written, hey, that's a really big game changer, because every developer, that saves like a half hour of time, right? And then if you have a security researcher looking through that, instead of maybe I have to switch from one code to another and learn, I can just reach through the comments and find the pattern that doesn't fit. That's a really good use of it. It'll save time.
And what I really like is that it really now aligns security with engineering. I think there was a trend with engineering where we kind of threw a little bit with the baby with the bathwater by saying you don't need architectural diagrams. What you need is quick iteration. Documentation is not that important. Yeah, well, everybody wants it, but nobody seems to have the time to do it, right? So to be able to start to describe the code, like for example, a threat modeling session, 90% of threat modeling is just getting a freaking decent architectural diagram done, right? Once you have it, you find the threads left, right, and center, right? But imagine being able that to be programmatically created. Imagine taking a code base and saying, hey, give me an architectural diagram of this. Describe me this code in UML, right? Give me a dot version of this code at this level of abstraction, right? That would be massive.
But that's the issue though, right? You have to trust the process by which it was created. And that's really what I'm getting at is how do we evaluate that trust?
Because real world comes into play. See, I don't have a problem with ChatGPT mistakes because I catch them, right? Like the dude fucking makes up shit, right? That's fine, right? Like, in a way, it'd be better. I just love the fact when he makes a mistake in the first answer and you correct and you go, oh yeah, you're right. Like, what the fuck? You could have
I think that's the key point right there.
But if you think about it, like, this isn't an existing vacuum, right? So for example, even those recommendations, even that stuff, you have feedback loops, right? In fact, you can even have another engine mapping up the feedback loop, right? So you can even use the output of one as a prompt to the next one, right? But we're now operating at a much more efficient level,
Yes.
So before you had to find the people who understand the code to describe what the hell that meant, right? Even like the legacy stuff, right? Like most developers didn't write the original code, so they don't fucking understand it, right? So to be able to say, this is how we believe it works, then reality come into play. You can even say, here are the logs, right? Can you match these logs to the architecture? Or find me all the places where these logs that I know for real are being invoked match this architecture. That was a question that before would be impossible almost to ask, right?
Yeah.
Now we're not that far off.
Yep. And to Nathan, your point about, like creating a framework and then you go code, maybe take the code and put it in a framework you can evaluate.
Which is cool. I mean, which is just damn awesome.
Right.
Sam, I feel like we've been talking over you, man.
No, it's just there's a couple of things to add. So basically, the ability to add comments to the code, I think what Dinis has mentioned, I think that's revolutionary by itself. Obviously, if we just walk away from us being security people, right? It's the amount of productivity that is going to add when you are trying to do reverse engineering and triaging of vulnerability in a legacy code is absolutely huge, right? So because obviously we have two types of problems, right, in application security. We have problem number one, how to make sure that the software which is being built right now is secure, right? And how do we remediate vulnerabilities in the legacy software which was built years ago by someone else, right? So there's two sides to the problem. The comment writing feature, I think it's very good in the same way that it can actually generate documentation. And again, you can ask it to generate documentation as if it was read by a 5-year-old, for example, or to a different audience. And the same thing with the vulnerabilities. What I found very interesting is that you can ask it, because obviously when it finds vulnerabilities, you can say, explain these vulnerabilities like I'm a CEO. I'm a non-technical person, and it will still do it. And I think
you brought it
to evaluate, because we are all techies, right? So when we have a problem of speaking to the management, speaking to the board, and actually explaining what is the actual risk, trying to say, oh, there's a deserialization issue, or the words like cross-site scripting or server-side request forgery. That just sounds like Chinese to any CEO and some CTOs as well.
Right.
And I think the fact that it's a language model and it can actually utilize the language to make things simpler, I think is quite important.
That's, you've touched on something that I want to get into here, if you don't mind. You touched on reverse engineering. So there's always the forensics or the reverse engineering of malware that I don't know if I've seen anybody use ChatGPT for, but you have obfuscated code that someone obfuscated because they don't want you to figure out how my malware is working. I think it would be really interesting to begin to look at, can we actually reverse engineer active malware with a ChatGPT-like system that actually lets us figure out real quick, what was the trigger and how do we fix it?
I totally think that's possible, right? I think that's just a case of having the right feeds, right? I once play with you saying, can you explain these, those JavaScript 4K codes. And if you ever seen it, like 2K codes, where you feel what the hell it is, right? And you can explain it, right? I think that's really cool. And Sam, on your world, I think it would be really cool, for example, to write WAF rules based on code, right? But also find gaps, right? Take, for example, a firewall and say, like, where are the blind spots in this?
Not
What actually is actually happening here?
not just the WAF rules, Dinis. The most amazing thing is, again, going back to SAST, right? You know, we're mostly SAST people, right? It writes the SAST rules, and it writes them because there's a semgrep and CodeQL. And there's an example. So obviously, I was on the chapter co-leader Sharif Mansour. He actually spent, I think, a week in ChatGPT, and he actually managed to write something very useful for his team. And he shared, actually, I know obviously we were in the chat mode, but Dinis, would you be able to allow me to share my screen? I think I should be able to. Right?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so because I can share the GitHub repo where that Sharif has created called InfoSec OpenAI examples. And here's you can see an example of CWE explanation, which is written by ChatGPT, and it is written for developer, and it explains what the code is vulnerable, and it also remediates the code. But after it remediates the code, you can ask OpenAI to write the semgrep rule, which will detect it and prevent it in the future, and then a CodeQL rule. Yeah, and obviously
Very nice.
I haven't tried it, but we should be able to also write a mod security CRS rule for the WAF as well, to stop it on WAF if it is a vulnerability which can be stopped on the WAF. So here it is doing sanitization and input validation. So there you go, you can see these are all the examples. So this is all available in this repo. And also there's also Python code, test Python code that you can play with. So I think this is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, let me just switch back to the actual code,
Dan, can you
because I
send me
want to
the
show
link?
you.
I would love to play with that after this. That's awesome, man.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously the languages, so it was implemented in several languages. So I can show you the languages where it is proven to be working. So that's Java, Python, C#, Swift, Kotlin, PHP, Rust, Go, and JavaScript. And basically ChatGPT will analyze the code, will describe the vulnerability in the code, will show an example of vulnerable code in that language, will show an example of remediation, and it will create semgrep rule to detect vulnerability and create a CodeQL rule to detect this vulnerability. And these are all the CWEs for which this is been basically demoed in this project. Yeah, I will copy paste the link in the chat. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing now. So there you go. That's the working example, and it's proven to be working.
And you see, Nathan, the built-in check is then we can review that, right? And we can make sure that it's correct. But also we can adjust it, right? We can say, oh, okay, this is actually more well explained, or this thing here. And then it might not be perfect the first time around, but it doesn't need to be perfect. But think about it, after 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 of those examples, the next one is going to be much better, right? And even more interestingly, then you can even say, okay, now write the HTTP request to trigger that exploit, right? And then you can even think about, okay, now deploy that rule in front of one, and then verify that that rule actually works, right?
I think that's the thing, though. Like, and the reason I bring it up is because this is the FUD. This is the FUD that people are going to try to throw at this. And it's, I mean, when you look at it, it's what we're looking at is way better than anything we have today. And I think it's really hard to argue that, oh, this, you know, an error here or there is going to really make this. Okay, yeah, I get it. Mistakes are going to happen. We have the way to correct. Move forward.
No, that's why we're humans, right? It still requires humans to review and confirm. And Dinis, as you said, it still sometimes doesn't get it right on the first time, but you can ask it to correct itself, and it will do.
When was the first time you had a coder get it right the first time?
Exactly.
At a college.
Exactly. So this is what someone's saying, that ChatGPT is really like an intern, right? Yeah. And basically it's an intern who you can ask and go and do some research, do some Googling, and bring the information back together as a project. So that's essentially what it does. But the thing that we're missing, this is a very early stage, right? Because ChatGPT really entered our lives in the past 4 or 5 months, right? And it's very early, and I'm looking forward to evolution. It's going to get significantly better very soon. And yeah, we organizations who are already utilizing the power of it, I think they're understanding how much further they can take it. And obviously, it's particularly the learning bit, because if we can basically feed back the human learning, so exactly for our AppSec purpose, right? So we ask you to find vulnerabilities in the code. And let's say I had this issue. So for example, there are 5 vulnerabilities in the code. And ChatGPT found 4 out of 5 and explained this 4 out of 5. But then I asked myself, hang on a minute, but there is another deserialization on line 55 of this file. And I said, oh yes, I apologize. I missed that. There is a deserialization, and here is how you should be remediating this. And it gave me the example. But the thing is, it didn't actually use the fact that I corrected it to learn and enhance its own knowledge base, so it doesn't make the same mistake next time. But I think it's coming, right? That's the next phase.
Security is trust but verify, right?
Yeah.
Learning is you learn when you make mistakes, because if you do it right the first time and you don't know, you don't know.
Right.
So yeah, that's at least the way I'm approaching chat AI is, if I can trust and then verify something, then I could probably automate it and move it forward. And then I know I have some known good, but that's you have to iterate that.
I think we're moving to a place here too, where the number of known vulnerabilities, the number of known issues in code is reaching we don't have enough humans on the planet to deal with this point.
Mm-hmm.
And as we look at something like this, we're going to have to figure out how to automate our way out of the mess that we're creating, because there aren't enough fingers left in the planet to hunt and peck for each of these vulnerabilities. So how do we correct this?
Or time.
Yeah, and to be honest, that is something that I feel is a key element here. Right? Like, I think for a long time, my main worry was I couldn't see how we could scale, right? And the only thing that didn't happen, I thought it would happen. I thought the attackers would get a lot more efficient and effective than they were. I still feel that we still at the pace where, for the amount of vulnerabilities that exist and for the complexity of the exploits of the ones that do exist, you still assume that, apart in some places, most attacks are not leveraging highly advanced things, right? There's a couple of places where they are, but I feel that this is the first time that I see a scale solution, because in the past, most of our solutions, I would go, this will never scale at large. If we really need to ramp this up, if you really need to start protecting all the NPM registries and all the, all the dependencies that we've got, and the pip dependencies, this finally, I think, gives us a good way to do that. The scalability of security practices. I think the difference now, and it's interesting because we are all of a generation, right? The difference now is that, are we going to be able to adapt, right? Or is the new generation going to completely sort of streamroll this, where for them, ChatGPT is what Google was for us.
Yeah.
Right. But also the difference is the time scales are much shorter, right? Google took, 10 years, 15 years, right? To really, gain this thing, where this is going to happen in a couple of years. In fact,
I think it's more like a couple of months, but yeah.
Yeah. And then the question will be, how do you protect against the AI agent itself, right? That's the next evolution, right? Of this. But I think in going back to the topic of this, if we can now start to leverage these technologies, we can actually make a huge amount of the security industry a lot more relevant. Because you guys just mentioned that, hey, these might make mistakes, but come on, our industry is a crazy offender of producing bad things, bad data, bad information, not connecting, not talking to each other, all that jazz, right?
Well, just thinking about, like we had talked a little bit about MISP before we got started. It's not something that's horribly used in the States, at least to my knowledge right now. But at the same time, you look at some of the things that you could do with, hey, I'm going to go ahead and shove a whole bunch of information into this model and come up with potential issues. That's insane.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I think we're in a nice place where I think we have a lot of the foundations in place, right? So if you look in terms of NIST, in terms of OS information, there's a lot of good thinking that has been done in the last 20 years of security, or more, at least, that I think is ripe for really taking to the next level. Like ASVS is a good example, right? It's great, but until you can create the 20-page of ASVS that matters to that application, it is never going to take off effectively.
Yeah.
right? So I think that's amazing. Imagine feeding the ASCS, feeding the source code and saying, okay, which ones are relevant? In fact, imagine feeding it the policies, feeding it compliance, feeding it the requirement, feeding it the risk, feeding it the threat vectors, right? And then say, okay, now take this. Now give me what I should care about. Where should I focus first?
Right. That's especially on a privately trained model. I mean, yes, I can spin you all sorts of scary stuff about a publicly trained model and an evil insider doing, you know, horrible things to you. But are you telling me that evil insider isn't going to find an easier way to like deal with your stuff? Come on.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've noticed Timo Pagel joined, and Timo, for those who don't know, is a project leader of a fantastic OWASP project called DevSecOps Maturity Model. So I think it would be great to bring him in and hear his opinion on the how ChatGPT can help in development of maturity models.
Yeah, come on, team, man, join in. I'm your co-host. So if you can join in. There we are.
Oh.
Hey.
You directly asked me. Yeah, I'm not having an answer. I have to think about an answer, right? That's not something where we can directly have a good answer. But
Well,
yeah,
he
might
thinks.
be valuable to ask ChatGPT. So a problem which I'm having is to identify at which level should an activity be, right? So I estimate, yeah, it's a kind of expert judgment. How much effort is it? How is the value? There are things which would be nice to ask ChatGPT about the opinion, but currently I would think it doesn't have a good opinion. I didn't ask, but I assume it doesn't have a good opinion.
You should try. You'll be surprised.
So as we get into this, I think looking at ChatGPT and what it's going to be good for is the first step, right? Like if we look at a process is to like, let's pretend that we all own a company and we're going to go ahead and use ChatGPT to do a thing. I like Timo's concept of what is the actual output and what money can we make? What is the driving force for doing A? What do we get out the back of it? And I think as we look at like code review, as we look at some of the things that we could probably have it do, there's a pretty substantial benefit coming out the back of that could probably be monetized from the CFO and say, hey, without this many errors, we will have this much more money because we've saved this much time. I think as we get into it, that's probably the way to go, though, if that's your point, Timo. Ish.
Yeah, that's how you could express it. Yeah.
But let's look at your example. You have the DevSecOps maturity model, right? So I think models like those, I think the real value is they set up the best practices. The problem is always how do you connect that with reality and actionable items? So what's interesting is to say, here's the latest version. And you think about it, some of these things you need that ingestion, right? Here's the latest version that has been modified. This is this week's version, whatever. This is the latest version of a particular maturity model. Here is now the code or the organization structure or the systems or the things or the practice or the CI pipeline that the organization has. What are the next things that should happen, right? And even see what is the maturity model of the organization based on this standard? Those are the kind of questions that you'll be able to ask something like ChatGPT once you can feed some of these data in there. And in fact, I think it's interesting because the latest version, it already allows you, I think it's 10,000 words, right, or something like that, to feed data in. So we also need to start thinking about how can you package things in a way that you can actually, feed the model, right, and then ask the question on top of the model.
Yeah,
I know people already do it. Yeah, go on. No, go on.
It would be very nice to give all the project source code to it, and then it tells you where you are, right? That would be amazing. So you don't need to think, it just says you that is done, that's not done. That's the next step. Yeah, that would be very cool. I think a lot of questions can be answered when you just give your code, right? Because you do infrastructure as code nowadays. So actually every point, not every point, but most of the points in such a maturity model, you could probably get a good answer.
One of the things I like about where Microsoft is going with this Bing is if you go up a little bit, no, Sam, keep sharing. That's great. So one of the things I like about this evolution is that they're starting to show the sources. And I think that's going to be an evolution here, right? I think the whole idea that it's also black magic, right, will move a little bit before. I think we get, because we want to know that, right? So I think, because you can even want to have one model kind of analyzing the other model answers to say how much of that is actually true, right? Or how much of that is actually made up. So I think you could, because there's these things called now the auto AI. I don't know if you guys seen those, which is when they actually try to automate and create and basically have these really nice workflow where you almost start to think about, here are the tasks you want, here are the models that you're going to use, here's the structure, here are the tasks, and then at the end. And when you do that, you start to be able to feed it a lot more complex data. And Tim, to your point, right? You should to say, here's my app, here's my architecture, here's my environment, here's my AWS environment, right? Here's my logs, right? Here's here is 2 gigabytes of CloudTrail logs, right? Now, apply now the DevSecOps principles or the DevSecOps thing here, right? And you see, those are the kind of questions that before would be crazy to answer, right?
Well, just think about it. I mean, I don't have to write IAM rules ever again. No more IAM rules. Off you go.
Yeah. Well, you now start to write intent, which is different. So you start to write rules. So your rules should be the intent. And this is where it gets really cool, because now you start to hit the business requirements. So you start to say, what I want is for these users to do this and that thing. What I want is for this project to have these properties.
And Dinis, can I also add one very important clarification? You can also ask, make the suggestions based on the assumption that the business type is medical or health, government, utilities.
Well, and all the regulations.
And this is all the regulations. That's where I found very good value, right? So for example, we can take any of the requirements and just say, okay, what do I need to address if I'm a medical organization? What do I need to address if I'm a bank? And please prioritize this for me if I'm an automotive manufacturer or airplane manufacturer. I think that's a very great value of large language model.
Well, context, right? And the whole point of the maturity model is exactly that, right? So if you look at, again, maturity model as an example, you should be able to say, where are we and what are the next steps and where should be the priorities? And then again, you can still verify that, but the ability for that to scale is enormous.
Well, just looking at I think the regulation point that Sam made is just horribly pertinent, especially with EU and GDPR and all of the crazy stuff that we have to start looking at is what is actually PII. Okay, we're going to go ahead and write this regulation body. That's great. And this corpus of text can be sucked into, and I get that this can't happen yet, sucked into, ChatGPT and go ahead and look at my code and tell me if any of this code is actually putting to logs something that is PII. I mean, that's been one of the gremlins for privacy for years. All of a sudden we have PII going to logs accidentally and oh my God, what the hell? But to be able to pull that out and say, well, look, we've seen all of this stuff and this function right here is going to do that bad thing. I mean, even just a highlight over 3 or 4 of those places as opposed to having to read millions of lines of code to find that. Huge benefit. Makes high trust a hell of a lot more achievable.
Yeah, because now you're describing intent. Right?
Yeah,
this is like the worldly maps, right? Like this is an evolutionary step, right? This is one of those where, the way I think about this is like the thing about really cool the worldly maps is that you've got the Genesis, custom build, product, and commodity, right? Now we don't know which one will jump from product to commodity, right? Like you think about it, before ChatGPT, who's going to get there first? If you made bets, you probably would say Google, right? Maybe even Apple or Tesla or other organizations or some of the AI things. But what these guys did with the GPT-4 was they made an evolutionary jump. Now we can predict what will happen next because the next jumps are not that great. They're just little evolutionary little things. The big jump has been done. So if you look at, for example, like we talk about Google, I stopped using Google for now because I prefer to describe the intent that I have. And unless it's an esoteric thing, I now spend my time describing what the intent I have and refining the intent that I have, which is a lot more efficient way of doing it.
Yeah.
Yes, but are you actually using ChatGPT? Because obviously, again, very interesting point about Google losing in this race, because as I just shared as my screen from Microsoft Bing search engine, because Bing actually combined the ChatGPT with live internet search results. And even though it takes a while because it thinks about an answer, what it comes back with is actually probably exactly what you described in terms of what you want to achieve. So there you go. Here, just ask about, again, since Timo is here, about what was DevSecOps maturity model, and it gave me the precise answer. And it suggested me the next question, which is how can I implement this model in my organization? So again, it provided me some information what needs to be done to implement in my organization. I can then it itself suggests the question, what are the benefits of using DevSecOps maturity model? And I think these additional prompts and the fact that it kind of leads you down a path. And I know probably we've all seen these answer suggestions from Outlook or from Microsoft Teams or whatever, or even from LinkedIn, when it suggests you some answers, but they were completely nonsensical up until now, because now it actually makes sense. For example, there you go. It says, well, you need to carry out a self-assessment of your organization's security practice. And I said, well, how do I do this? And it tells me more. So yeah, and only Microsoft Bing has it at the moment. Google, I think it still needs to catch up.
But ChatGPT UI will give you this, right? Again, this is just on a Bing environment, right? But because it comes from there, right? But it seems that's the thing. It's the feeding of the model, right? And what gets interesting is when you can give it data, when you say, here's my organization. And to be honest, this is where the next discussion, for example, of, again, let's go back to DevSecOps model, right? I think we now need to think about how can you feed data that is relevant to the DevSecOps model that allows good, basically not just a review, but the analysis. Because think about it, in the past, you create the model, then you go, how do you evaluate this? And that would be a massive manual effort to do it, right? Because how do you review it? Where now we can say, okay, if you are on this, let's say if you have Google Cloud, right? Then you need to get this data feed. If you have AWS, then you get that data feed. If you have GitHub, then you get this data. You get GitLab, you get this feed, right? So then that can then be the feeding of the data to the model, right? And then you can have the actions, and then you start to have the feedback loop, right? And then as time changes, you can then say, okay, well, and then you say, okay, here was the last analysis. Here's where we are now. How much have we progressed, and what are the next steps?
I think as we get into it, I mean, beyond all of that, even let's look at it from an operationalist's point of view. So let's pretend now that we're all operationalists and we have to keep our company alive for the next, take your pick. I mean, how cool would it be from a DevSecOps model to be able to say code on one side, I'm off camera here, code on one side and monitoring and ops on the other. And now not only can I tell you that both things actually are being like evaluated, like I'm looking at your code and I have the monitors for operations to hand them and say, this is actually getting monitored all the time. The observability for this is right here. And being able to click on it and go back to the actual function that monitor's testing. I mean, the ability, so geeky incident responder in me goes, oh my God, like I can actually look at all of these things and say, this goes back to this set of code and this is why this is happening.
It's a game changer. This is what I'm saying. Yeah. I think the security vendors, which are a critical part of the infrastructure, right? They really need to step up, because most of the tools now, for me, start to feel primitive. Like, really, I cannot ask this kind of question. Really, I'm going to have to SQL or this kind of complex queries, right? Like, I want context, right? And a lot of the times, a lot of the engines, a lot of the business build engines on top of it, and they need to restructure to say, they need to be using a ChatGPT-like environment. They need to start creating their graphs in a way that is consumable by that. And I think that's the biggest transformation. The biggest transformation is that now graphs will really scale, because that's what these engines can consume very, very well. So we can now use graphs for context, but we don't have to create them. We just have to almost start thinking about the instructions for how to create a model around it, right? And there's already a nice marketplace for models, right? So we need to start having models again for the bits that we use, right? And you could even argue that every framework should eventually come up with a model that understands how that framework behaves.
Yeah.
Right. Because every framework has things that, are unique to them. So, the Spring framework, the, the Express framework, the Fast API framework, whatever, the .NET, REST API framework, all those frameworks have behaviors that then once you have a model that understands it, you can ask so much better questions on it, right? And that's why I think that's a big game changer. I think in the security world, what I would say is that we are well poised to leverage this. And I think the good security teams should now be driving a lot of innovation, because we should be on the forefront of all these transformations.
I agree.
And then the next thing is, how can we change the business with it, right? Because I got to the point for me where I feel I need to understand the business in order to protect the business, right? Most of the changes that we want to do are changes to the business. So I see that the real interesting opportunity here is help the business to understand itself, drive change there, so we can push the security changes with it.
I think there's that, but I mean, and I think that's if you look at how, the overarching, thing that's going to drive this into business is the fact, hey, we can make more money on that. The reality of being able to look at these things and be able to say from like just the stupid, simple things that it could do. I was talking to I was talking to a red teamer that got shoved into incident response. And he had to make a choice, and he decided that he was going to clear out all of the AWS API credentials for a service when he realized that his company had been hacked. And I expressed to him that was probably a bad choice. And he said, well, but why? I said, well, because you just caused an 8-hour outage for your website. That was bad. And, as an incident responder, we can get that, we can understand that. But if you could build out a model that allows you to ask questions like that as you're going and be able to say, hey, what's the right answer here? And be able to have it give you a contextual response of, well, if you do that, these are the things that are going to proceed from that thing. Now, I don't expect it to be able to say, no, don't do that. That's a bit much. But just give you a contextual response about, hey, this is what's happening right now. It would be really nice to know that I shouldn't delete the AWS API credentials. These are the things that are going to come out of that choice.
Or context, right?
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, Nathan, I think is also decision trees, right? So
Yes.
in the context of security incident response, that's actually one of the advantages, that it can actually give you decision trees. And as we just seen in my live demo, that it can take you down a specific path. So it can go go deeper and deeper, and if necessary, go down to the line of code or particular change. And I know some companies already started doing things like feeding change requests that they made to the configuration of the systems into it. So that makes interesting what change affected this incident.
Absolutely. See, but this makes a decision tree scale. The challenge I always have with the decision tree path is that to be really useful, it has to be very specific. In order to be very specific, it becomes massive, right? And then people get overwhelmed, right? Because you need the detail. What this allows us to do is to have context. You have a massive object model, a mass decision tree, but you only see this bit. And that bit, more importantly, not just it's a small bit, is in context. And in fact, this is an example where some of the next generation of ChatGPT-like technologies, we don't want deviation. I think at the moment with this first experimentation, we're still at the mode where we almost, again, it's fun that it makes mistakes and it's fun that it's not 100% correct. But we can get to a point where we say, we don't want that. We want to say, this is your body of knowledge. Don't use anything else. Just use that. That's the current decision tree. What you need to understand is what those words mean in the action of that. But from a decision point of view, or the sequence of events, should be your truth. So again, we're not that far off from it. This is just a question of what data you feed them on versus the model having. In fact, I think sometimes the current models are too powerful. We actually need less powerful, some of these engines that don't have all the emotion and don't have all the ambiguity, don't have all the ability to come up with things, just have the ability to understand and execute on certain things.
Well, something stupid simple, like let's give it the corpus of Windows Server code, just that thing, and then we're going to give it all of IT manuals for the last 20 years. And I, as I, as a new person coming out of college, need to do an AD setup. How do I do an AD setup? Done.
More importantly, how do I do an AD setup with this configuration?
Correct.
Yeah. And this configuration is going to be different than that one. So the context.
Well, or
has
even
be
to ask me the questions about, do you want to do this, that, or the other? And these are the outcomes, to your point about decision trees. I mean, in many cases, the decision tree is actually the thing that the new person doesn't have yet. They don't even know that they don't know. How do I even begin to ask that question?
Yep. And I think that's the sweet spot now, right? I think companies who can address that, and in security, we are such a complex world now that we are ripe for that innovation. And I think that's what gets interesting. And it's like Sam was showing it. You now can start some really lovely feedback loops between the tools. Where you feed here and you feed that, and then you almost let reality validate it. If you think about it, if I'm saying that I have a WAF rule, I have a rule here, I have a thingy here that's supposed to lock this down, then the next time you get the data, you should confirm that, right? So, this it's not a zero-sum game, right? So, and I think that's where it gets interesting, is when you feed models to models, when you chain them, which eventually it can go south very fast, but I think it also has a massive potential to accelerate a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Cool. Right, guys. Oh, Sam's gonna give us another good example.
Sam's going to do one more thing.
Yeah.
Sam's on mute.
Sam, you're mute.
So what Sam's showing us here is a summary of reporting on incidents, which is interesting because it actually gives us the source code that it came up with.
Yeah. So the question here was, how can I use ChatGPT for security incident response? So, but very interestingly, right? It contains an ad. Can you see this? It actually advertises Microsoft Sentinel and Defender.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. You should ask me. It was the answer above, influenced by Microsoft.
That's great.
In fact, I think there's a really cool tool that should be built, which is to understand the bias of the engines. And I actually think that tool is really important, because we talk about these engines being sentient one day, right? Hopefully not that far, but I think we need to start detecting that. And I think we need to start having almost like pen testing a GPT engine to see, for example, like that, does it have bias? Does it have bias on gender, but also does it have bias on data points? Does it have bias against companies? Does it have bias against, for example?
Well, it's owned by Microsoft, and I just showed you an example of how it was biased towards it.
Obviously, it's a little biased.
Exactly, right? But that's an important point, right? It's an important point to understand the bias of this, right? And I think it's one of those cases that as the technology matures, it's again, like, we need to understand the framework that we're dealing with, because this is going to become old news very fast. We're going to expect to talk to our engines. We're going to expect to talk to this. Going back to the Microsoft Copilot, if you look at, there's a whole raft of Copilot products that they're launching now for Word, for PowerPoint, for all these things, right? So they're really raising the level, but we need to start framing, but also identifying the bias and limitations of the engine. So pen testing is a good tool in the engines themselves, right?
Different sort of pen test.
Yeah, different sort of pen test, right? But understand those blind spots, right? But I feel that because you can feed one to the other, we will basically ratchet up quite effectively a lot of the stuff that we're doing.
So when we teach them to feed one to the other, and then we feed one to the other, and then we teach it to feed one to the other, what happens?
Yeah,
we make Skynet.
That's the thing. Well, it's when you have actions that's that they, but that's it's an interesting concern, right? I think it's a valid concern that these paths leads to that. Hey, Billy, you had you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, good.
Perfect. I was just gonna chime in about the bias thing. I actually seen people test that to see if it has a certain bias based on different views or things like that. And what they were able to determine was that it will have a bias based on how you frame a conversation. So if you ask it, like, I don't want to start a war in here or anything, but if you ask it something like, point out the ways that this political leader is a tyrant, and it will post exactly that. It'll post all of the things against that particular leader. But if you post a question where it's like, where it's more political or like more of an equal footing, then it will try to answer it based on that. So I think if you really, what it really boils down to is people are going to get the answers that they really want until they can make it more of a make it where it checks for that kind of context. But yeah.
And that's why if you think that almost, I guess, to our world, it's interesting to think that you can have a world where we have a security bot that is used by developers, by engineers, by practitioners that we have already fed our BIOS, right? And in that way, the BIOS could be a good thing because we want specific things to occur. We want specific frameworks to be used. We want security practices to be used, right? So, if you imagine, like, if you have a developer running a web service and using a bot to help it, we want the bot to already think about the best way to deploy the web service, the best way to protect it, the best way to authenticate it, to validate all that jazz, right? So it's an interesting way. There's also, once you understand how we can influence an engine, and I agree that the way you ask the questions, it can determine the outputs, but it's also a way to understand your audience, right? And I'm assuming now this is, let's say, in an environment where you can see the feedback loops. So cool, guys. We're on the hour. I've learned a lot of good stuff. Sam, thanks for sharing those. Those are really cool, right? And I think we need to do that one of these every 2 months because things are going to change so fast, right? We need to start showing some good examples of this going on.
Yeah. So going back to your favorite topic, again, for people who haven't seen Dinis's talk at the OWASP London about using Jira for managing your security program. So of course, one of the things that you can use, and I've seen people start using ChatGPT remediation advice, for example, for application security, just create Jira tickets.
Yeah.
And with the text in these Jira tickets will be context specific and very relevant and in a language which can be understood by software developers.
And find who's doing that. I haven't seen good examples of that. Let me know who's doing it. Let's invite them to do a session, right? I'd love to see that. Cool. Any final words, Sam, on this topic?
I think it's very important for us to understand that this is all very new, and we're already seeing some very exciting developments. I had conversation with a few vendors and saying, well, are you threatened by this? And they said, no, we actually embrace it. That's where I see probably in the next year, we will see security vendors, SaaS vendors, and just cybersecurity vendors actually embracing this technology. And finally, the AI on the data sheet is going to mean something, not just, we use AI and machine learning, so please buy us. And we also use blockchain, right? The usual buzzwords. So I think this evolution is coming. And again, we have a responsibility from security and engineering perspective, just make sure that it's also secure, the use of it is secure. I know we haven't touched on topics like privacy and, giving it personal data, company data, and company intellectual property, such as source code. And that's probably a topic for the next conversation.
Yeah.
Hacking GPT is a different, sort of thing.
Cool. Any final thoughts, Nathan?
I think we need to approach ChatGPT, and frankly, any of the other chatbots very much the same way we approached cloud and very much the way we approached, databases back in the 80s, right? I mean, this is a change to the way that things work, and that's okay. And it's not the end of the world. And there are going to be things that we need to work through, and there are going to be errors, and we're going to screw up, and we're going to fix it, and it'll be okay.
Yeah, I agree. Timo?
Yeah, I think it will be amazing. So in the future, maybe only the person who can ask the right question will get paid in a good way.
Yeah, well, it's more reality now than it was 4 months ago, right? But I think it's like the internet, right? Like, changed a lot, but then we evolve and we go to the next level, right? So I think the difference is going to be between the people who use it and the people who don't use it. And I think that's why we need to learn how to use this very effectively. So cool. All right, guys. Thanks a lot for this one. We're starting to move the needle, and I'll see you guys on the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.